Hello, Internet.
Jordan here from Out the Mead. Today, I'm going to be starting up an experiment to try and find out if it's possible to ruin your homebrew by pitching too much yeast. I've seen a small handful of brand new brewers showing up on Reddit or Discord or whatever else, trying to find out if they have irrevocably ruined their brew by pitching a whole 5-gram dry packet of yeast instead of a half packet. They're pretty much always immediately told the age-old wisdom to relax, have a homebrew. But just to ease everyone's mind, I thought it'd be cool to try and do an experiment that demonstrates how it is actually quite difficult to ruin your homebrew by overpitching. Of course, experienced brewers would get really bored with this video really fast if all I did was compare a 2.5 gram per gallon pitch rate with a 5 gram per gallon pitch rate. So that's not what we're gonna do. I'm gonna be brewing 3 identical batches. All of them will be starting from the same must, divided up into 3 buckets, each with a 1 1/4 gallon primary volume. The intent being that I will still have a gallon to fill up a carboy nice and tight in secondary. The only difference between the 3 buckets is going to be how much yeast I pitch when we start off fermentation. The first bucket will be my control, using that 2.5 gram per gallon and a quarter in this case, pitch rate. 2.5 grams is actually a slight underpitch if you were to put this recipe in a nutrient calculator and try to find out the recommended pitch rate, but I know a lot of new brewers use a half packet of yeast for pretty much anything at or under about 3 gallons at the recommendation of one of the bigger homebrewing channels that a lot of newbies start with. So I figured it's still a fair place to start. For the second bucket, rather than simply going up to 5 grams, I'm gonna go a whole factor of 10 beyond the 2.5 gram batch and use 25 grams. This is the equivalent of 5 whole 5 gram dry yeast packs. Unless you're buying yeast in bulk, I really don't see how even a brand new homebrewer is going to overpitch by this much, but I theorize that this bucket will churn out perfectly fine. And then of course, because I watched a little too much Mythbusters growing up, the third bucket has to be complete and total overkill, in an attempt to show you just how far you actually have to go before you damage the flavor of your homebrew by overpitching. I'm sorry, you thought I was done? I hope it's not too disappointing to find out I won't actually be able to use all of the yeast I just showed you. It was probably somewhat obvious given the fact that it literally doesn't fit in the bucket. What I decided to do was take the biggest individual brick I have, a whole 500 grams of dry yeast. The idea here is that since all of the yeast will be coming out of the same single package, we should have the most consistent test I can possibly produce in my homebrew lab. It's hypothetically possible that there might be slight variations between different packages of yeast. Maybe one of them was left in the mailroom for too long and got too hot or something, I don't know. So I'm gonna crack open this brick, take 2.5 grams of it for the first bucket, then take 25 grams of it for the second bucket, and then pour literally the entire rest of it into the overkill bucket. That should be somewhere in the ballpark of 470 grams or so. I would certainly hope that even a brand new homebrewer would never accidentally overpitch by that much, but I guess we're gonna find out if it can ruin your mead. For the recipe, I was planning to use 6 pounds of clover honey in primary, and then add water up to 3.75 gallons, which should divide evenly into 3 1 1/4 gallon batches. 1 1/4 gallons in primary should leave me plenty to fill up a carboy all the way to the top and have minimal headspace in secondary. 6 pounds of honey in 3.75 gallons of water should take me right to about 6% potential for ABV. The yeast that I'm going to be using, Lafort's F33, has an on-paper ABV tolerance of 16%, so it should be able to take this dry very easily. I'm doing my best to make sure that all 3 brews ferment to the same gravity, and I thought that could be a little difficult if I was aiming for anything less than bone dry, so that's what we're doing. For nutrients, in retrospect, I probably should have added the nutrients in a single dose before I divided up the must, but I was having a bit of a day and didn't think about that, so I ended up trying to add as exactly as I could this specific amount into each of the individual buckets. There's unfortunately probably very minor differences in how much went into each batch, but I got it as close as I could. Sorry. In any case, each of the 3 batches I used received 2.2 grams of Fermaid O, 2.5 grams of Fermaid K, and 1.3 grams of diammonium phosphate. I did not use GoFirm on this batch because I wanted to make sure it was a level playing field, and the amount of GoFirm and water that you use to rehydrate your yeast with depends on how much yeast you're using. There would have been significantly more water and significantly more nutrients in each of the bigger buckets, especially the overkill bucket, if I used GoFirm. So rather than risk introducing a bunch of really crazy new variables, I decided to just dry pitch. And to be fair, one of the main motivations for this experiment in the first place is brand new brewers who might be worried about overpitching, and most of the time they're dry pitching anyway. That all said, I got on to mixing up my must. The first thing I had to do was weigh out my honey. And I want to note that this hanging scale here is not necessarily the most precise tool that I have, but it doesn't matter a ton on this particular recipe if I hit exactly 6 pounds or not. It wasn't really going to make a difference in the end, as long as what went into all 3 buckets was the same must. With the honey weighed out, I took the bucket inside, then sanitized the bowl so that I could start collecting water from the filter at my sink right until I hit the 3 3/4 gallon mark on my bucket. Next was the mixing. I broke out the drill stir and absolutely went to town on this. I wanted to make sure that the mixture was as homogeneous as possible so that there wasn't going to be any variation between the 3 batches when I split it up. And while I was at it, I tried out the slow motion setting on my camera just for fun. When I was finally satisfied with the stirring, I decided it was time for a gravity measurement. And I surprisingly found that I actually had gotten all the way up to 1054. That's around a 7.7% potential for ABV, a little bit higher than I was aiming for, but again, it doesn't actually matter that much on this one as long as I'm confident all 3 buckets are getting the same must to start with. Next, I set out my 3 buckets and began dividing up the must as equally as I could. With the must divided, it was finally time to weigh out the yeast that I was going to be using on the first 2 buckets. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but I got the first one as close as I could to 2.5 grams, and frankly, since I weighed that, it's probably actually closer to 2.5 grams than most people who eyeball a half packet of dry yeast. Anyway, I went on to the second bucket, weighed out 25 grams, and then the entire rest of the 500 gram brick dumped into the third bucket in all its slow motion glory. Or horror, as it were. It was honestly kinda disgusting. Honestly, at this point, the yeast smell just overwhelms any of the honey smells that you would normally get when mixing up a must, and it just kind of smelled like an old locker room or a sweaty gym sock or something. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was somehow a dehydrated insect in the bottom of my yeast bag. You can see it drop out on camera right about here. I've never seen an insect in any of the little 5 gram packs that we often use as homebrewers, but I guess that's the kind of thing that can happen when you're dealing with larger volumes of yeast. That said, I'm not super worried about it because I know that bugs get into a lot of our food processing stuff anyway, and frankly, they're just usually too ground up for you to notice them. But I also didn't really want them in my brew, so off camera, I grabbed a pair of tweezers, sanitized them, extracted this little bug, and hawked them in the trash. With the yeast now pitched, I decided to give it all one good drill stir. Probably wasn't entirely necessarily on the 2.5 gram pitch bucket, but I gave it a whirl anyway. On the 25 gram bucket, it actually took a little bit of a second to whirl around and get the yeast mixed in. But on the third bucket, honestly, you guys, I know I have enough yeast to go even more overboard than this if you want to see it just to go completely overboard and be ridiculous and for entertainment's sake, but it's already really gross. It smells horrible, and I'm not really sure how much more yeast I can even add and still manage to dissolve all of the yeast into the must. I'm having a hard time imagining even a first-time brewer mistakenly adding this much yeast. I think we might have done it. I think we might have gone overkill enough here. Maybe I'm a wuss and y'all don't really mind the smell of yeast, but I thought this was frankly disgusting. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Anyway, apparently not satisfied with the abomination that I had before me, I managed to twitch my finger on the drill stir a little too hard, which immediately spewed this yeasty, gross, soupy mess all over the place for the entire internet to see for the rest of history and make fun of me for. Oh boy. Strangely enough, most of what spilled appears to have actually just been the yeast. So, I don't know, maybe we ended up with more like 450 grams in there at the end. But there wasn't really much that could be done about it at this point, so I moved on to weighing out my nutrients. Again, I tried really hard here to get these as close to exact amounts as I could so that there wouldn't be any variation between the 3 buckets. I really should have added all of the nutrients into the primary must before I divided it up, but too late by this point. I think I actually did a pretty good job measuring out these nutrients very precisely, but I wasn't done being a klutz yet. Somewhere in this process, I had apparently gotten a drop of sanitizer on my jar of Fermaid K, right at the exact spot that I put my thumb around the jar as I went to put it back on the shelf. Somehow it didn't break, but I pretty much gave myself a heart attack. Anyway, I finished measuring out the rest of the nutrients, again, as accurately as I possibly could. Made sure they were all mixed into the must, and called it good. In spite of several glaring human errors in the process, I think we are pretty reasonably and mostly successfully underway. I cleaned up some of my production mess, and came back to these 3 buckets about 15, maybe 20 minutes later, to find that the 400 plus gram bucket was already bubbling away happily. To be clear, as a general rule, don't use airlock activity as a gauge of fermentation. However, under these specific circumstances, I do think that actually indicated that that bucket was already fermenting while the other 2 were kinda still warming up. That overpitched bucket might be an offense to the senses and the wallet alike, but at least I can say it appears to be fermenting faster, and that pretty much brings us to a wrap. I'll be doing an update video in a couple weeks where we'll find out if the 25 gram bucket or the overloaded bucket ended up being ruined. My guess is going to be no and yes, respectively. And as a final closing remark here, I just want to remind you that this video is not intended as something that you should reproduce at home. In fact, I'm actively going to advise you not do this at home. This video is someone on the internet doing something both stupid and expensive, specifically so that you don't have to waste your own time, money, and resources satiating your curiosity. Please do not let my sacrifice go in vain. Settle for this video. Don't recreate this experiment at home. And if all goes according to the plan, in a couple weeks, we'll be able to show new homebrewers that accidentally pitching a whole packet instead of a half packet is not a problem in any way, shape, or form. While more experienced brewers will probably show up just to laugh at the faces I'm likely to make when I try tasting the overloaded bucket. I am not looking forward to that. But until then, this has been Jordan from Arrow to the Mead. Thank you for joining me, and have a good however long until I see you again.